No, the people of God were careening downward. They were worshiping false gods, worshiping the true God falsely, trampling down the very people God had called them to care for. The prophets came and denounced this rebellious behavior, and the prophets announced God's will. Most of their announcements were very grim. Hear this word that the Lord has spoken against you, O people of Israel, against the whole family that I brought up out of the land of Egypt. You only have I known of all the families of the earth, therefore I will punish you for all your iniquities. The people thought that being chosen by God meant escaping punishment. But just the opposite is true. Like many a parent, God punishes the ones he loves. Just like a good parent, the purpose of the punishment, or sometimes even just the threat of the punishment, is to change behavior. The prophets have the thankless task of standing up in public places and announcing that God is angry with them and God is getting ready to punish them. Does God want to punish them? No. In fact, God hopes that when the people hear the prophet's words, they will change their behavior. They will repent. God hopes that the prophet's words will not come true. The little story of Jonah is about just such a message. The fish really isn't the center of the story. The center of the story is a prophet named Jonah who is supposed to go and pronounce God's will in Nineveh, but he runs away from God's call. Inside the belly of the whale, Jonah realizes he can't escape from God, so when God calls him the second time, he goes to Nineveh. He announces, in 40 days God will destroy Nineveh. Lo and behold, the people listen to him. They repent, and God spares the city. The prophet's words are not set in stone. They are meant to change the hearts of rebellious people. Sad to say, most people did not listen to the prophets. They were shunned, persecuted, and often killed. They said words that challenged the status quo. They did outrageous things to call attention to the people's sins. One of my favorite stories is what Jeremiah did with his underwear. God told him to take a pair of underwear and bury them in a rock, under a rock in the mud, near the river. After a couple of months, God told him to dig out the underwear. Then Jeremiah walked through the town center, holding this filthy rag on a stick and shouting, "People of Israel, God wanted to be as close and as intimate with you as a man is to his underwear. But look at what you've become. God is disgusted by your filthy lives." Tough and shocking words. And then some years later, when the empire of Babylon threatened to conquer Jerusalem, when all the false prophets were saying, "God will take care of us, God will take care of us," Jeremiah showed up and said, "Don't fight them. Surrender to them because they are God's instrument sent to punish you for your idolatry." It's no wonder that Jeremiah never got his country's Man of the Year award. He barely escaped with his life. Now, we don't have the time in this course to explain which prophets spoke to which people at which time. At the end, I'll give you some websites that you can check out if you're interested. The witness of these prophets, though, is very important for those of us who call ourselves Christians. The prophets help us see more clearly God's passion for humanity and God's commitment to our restoration. The prophets also describe so clearly humanity's rebellion against God. If you want to learn what sin looks like in human relationships, and how sin affects governments and societies, how sin distorts attitudes toward the downtrodden, read the prophets. The prophets were not appreciated during their own lifetimes. They were despised, rejected, and often killed. But many years later, when the country lay in ruins and God's bewildered people tried to figure out what had happened, they reread the prophets. They realized that the prophets had been true spokesmen for God. So the people preserved their words in the hope that future generations would not fall into a misery like theirs. And this part of the story does end in misery. As we mentioned earlier, Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, fought a sporadic civil war for hundreds of years. But they had little power beyond their own borders. All across the Middle East, empires were rising and rumbling. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, these were the superpowers of the time. Poor little Israel and Judah were on a crucial bit of land that lay in the midst of these powers, so they were invaded first from one direction, then another. In 722 BC, the Assyrian army conquered the northern kingdom, and, as was their custom, they deported most of the inhabitants and brought in settlers from other conquered lands. The 10 northern tribes were dispersed and lost their religious and cultural identity. That part of the chosen people was no more. You can read about that ending in 2 Kings verse 17, or chapter 17. Now we might think that seeing the destruction of their northern brothers and sisters would wake up and shape up the remnant of the chosen people in the southern kingdom. But they said, well, we have the temple. We have the Ark of the Covenant. We have the holy city Jerusalem. God is still on our side. They continued to violate the covenant God had made with them. God, however, was faithful to the covenant. God had promised that disobedience would bring punishment. And eventually it did. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar led his armies against the southern kingdom. In 586 BC, they entered and ravaged Jerusalem, desecrated the temple, and destroyed the nation. They then took all of the political and religious leaders into captivity in Babylon. You can read of that tragedy in 2 Kings chapters 24 and 25. And you also might want to read the book of Lamentations, which expresses the people's grief over the loss of their city, their temple, their nation, and their homes. The roller coaster has plunged to the very bottom of its run. This people called to be a holy nation has gone from the prestige and power of David and Solomon to the total destruction of their homeland, with only a handful of exiles trying to survive in a foreign land. Of course, we need to remember that this happened over the space of 400 years. Empires are always rising and falling, in their day just as in ours. The key question for us is not about the national survival of Israel or Judah. Our key question is this: what now? Ever since God picked Abraham, God has been committed to using these people to somehow reach and save the world. But now they are ripped and torn apart, beaten and battered almost beyond recognition. What will be God's next move? That's the question we'll try to answer in our next session. Here's some questions you might want to think about. Looking at the Solomon stories, how do his problems dealing with wealth compare to those that we see today? Connecting faith and life were a problem for the chosen people. Is that still an issue today, and how do we handle it? Do fire and brimstone sermons work today? Why or why not? And then, here are just a few sites for those of you who want to dig deeper. Thank you for listening, and God bless.